بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. جزاكم الله خير, everyone, for coming out again to another week of Towards the Hereafter, where we're reading the book from Ibn Qudama, Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasideen, which is a summary of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin. Alhamdulillah, this week we've reached the section on al-uzla, which would be isolation, or he talks about as well khalwa, which is sort of spiritual isolation. Either or, regardless, the topic of which is, if the last part was being with people, now we're shifting to focusing on being away from people. And it's important, or it's interesting and important for us to recognize this, because as Ibn Qudama mentions in the second part of the chapter, is that the reason and why we have these two is going to be based on people, their dispositions, and where they are in life. There will be certain times in which being around people is healthy and good, conducive for our spiritual well-being, and there are other times in which we need to be in isolation, away from people. فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه في الدارين. The author, may Allah be pleased with him and allow us to benefit from his knowledge in this life and the next. He says, اختلف الناس في العزة والمخالطة. People, the ulama, people, but he's talking about the scholars, have differed in the difference between which is better, being in isolation or being mixing, interacting with the people. And some of them have said that there are benefits and there are harms to both being with people, and there are benefits and harms to being away from people. And most of the people who preferred zuhud, asceticism, being not having the dunya or trying to relinquish ourselves of dunya, preferred being in spiritual isolation. And I'm adding spiritual isolation because what he's talking about has a level of intentionality. It's not just like going to the woods and sitting there and, I don't know, listening to music or whatever all day long. There's an intentionality to, I'm going to do this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to help benefit me in my connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then he starts off this chapter by mentioning many different people of the Salaf who preferred being in isolation, whether it be Sufyan al-Thawri, Ibrahim ibn Adham, Dawood al-Ta'i, Fudayl ibn Iyad, Bishop ibn Hafi, والآخرين, and other than them. These are all from the Atba' al-Tabi'een of the Salaf. Sufyan al-Thawri was from the Sahaba, but then he starts going on. No, he wasn't. Sorry, from the Tabi'een. And who differed in these things. But because this chapter is focusing on specifically being in spiritual isolation, he brings a set of quotes and ahadith from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ talking about that. Now, before we even get into those things, we need to be mindful of the point of thinking or talking about being in spiritual isolation or in uzla is not so that because we are so good and everyone else sucks. The point in this is for us to focus on ourselves. And it's really important that we have that mindset, because it's very easy to become arrogant in our perspective of thinking, well, I'm going to be away from people because everyone sucks. Or everyone is not on the level that I am, and by us being together, then something, whatever, I'm going to be affected by these people. The reason why we should be thinking about this is because, one, we need to be stronger to properly handle being around others. Meaning, I don't have the ability to be in the hadra, to be in the presence or the mindfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when I'm with people. So then, therefore, I fall into the same things they fall into. It's a very unique perspective here. It's not that I'm going to be negatively impacted by them. It's because I don't have the ability, the discipline, the self-control, the strength to navigate these circumstances. And so because I'm around them, I'm going to fall into what they fall into. The first, where I think I'm going to be impacted by them, has a little bit of belittling of those people. The second has a humility on my disposition and recognizing that I have the same deficiencies as everyone else. And we have to be very, very careful in the perspectives and the frames that we have so that we can ensure that how we think of people is not going to be looking down upon them. The second reason perhaps why is because I find more connection doing other things. So by me being in isolation, I'm able to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm able to be in a more controlled state or a better state of dhikr than I would in public. So therefore I prioritize that. And this is another reason why. Again, not because they have an issue, but because this is better, more conducive for me and my disposition. And as Ibn Qudama mentions, the ulama of the past have given the same, they've used this, you could use the same metaphor as marriage. For some people, probably 75% of us nowadays, we need to get married because it'll help us spiritually, it'll help us physically, and other reasons to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for some people, marriage will distract them from focusing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have higher aspirations, higher goals, and they don't even care about all the workings and things that have to do with marriage. So he mentions a bunch of statements, starting with, first he mentioned that some of the Salaf who preferred being isolation. Then he mentioned some of the ones that preferred being with and around people, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Sarih al-Sha'bi, Ibn Mubarak, and other than them. And both have their proofs as to which one is better and which one is not. And they're very well known. He said, as far as the scholars that have talked about being in isolation, they start off with, or one of the proofs they use is from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where someone asked the Prophet ﷺ, who is the best of people? And the Prophet ﷺ said, a man or a woman a person who struggles against themselves internally and economically. And then a person that is amongst people and they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protecting people from their shar, from their wickedness. So someone who fights and struggles against themselves, both internally and economically, but also a person who is amongst others and they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and protect other people from their own deficiencies. And so again, this internal framing, Jazakumullah khair, Shuda, smileys, may Allah bless smileys. Anyways, Allahumma salli Muhammad. Another hadith is wherein someone asked the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu who is someone who is successful? He said, the one who controls their tongue and they stay in their homes and they cry over their sins. Umar al-Khattab, he says, benefit as much as you can by being in spiritual isolation. Sa'id ibn Abi Waqqas, he says, I wish that between me and the people was a door made of metal, where they didn't speak to me and I didn't speak to them, so that until the point where I can meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how they thought about these things. He's not saying, I need a door to protect me from these evil people. He's not saying, I need a door because they're so bad. He says, I need a door so they don't speak to me. I can just focus on Allah. I can isolate. I can really lock in, as we say nowadays, right? And so again, the perspective is not, this is from the ulama. This was Sa'id ibn Abi Waqqas. These are some of the people, the narrators of ahadith. And that's how they looked at things. Ibn Mas'ud, he says that, he said, be a person who is a spring of knowledge, that from them other people benefit from their knowledge. Someone who is a lantern in the night, meaning up and praying. A hermit in their house, then has a formidable heart, a heart that's always focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is thoughtful in the way that they dress. By doing that, you will be someone who Ahl Sama know him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels know who he is, and you won't be a burden upon the people of the lands. Another way to translate it could be that we'll have a light touch. We'll be light with the people on the earth. And I think that is very, very beneficial. Obviously, we want to be recognized, remembered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels, and therefore will benefit from others. But I think also because having a light touch or being someone someone who doesn't burden others or isn't heavy with others is important because sometimes, oftentimes, we want to be that. We want to be influencers. We want to be people that others know or look up to or revere. And so he's saying, no, we need to do the opposite. We need to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being a spring of knowledge. We benefit other people. We be someone who is up at night praying, a hermit in our homes with formidable hearts that are aware, always focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ibadah, that are thoughtful about how we carry ourselves. And by doing that, that's how we get known in the heavens, and we don't worry about being known in this earth. Abu Darda, he says, blessed be the one who is a hermit in their home, and they protect their tongue, their private parts, and their eyesight, what they're looking at. And he said, and be careful about sitting or being in the souk, in the marketplace, because it will distract you and it will cancel out. It will remove you for the things that you've been working to protect and build in your heart. Again, he's saying it's a blessing to be in isolation. Dawood al-Ta'i, he said, "Firru min al-nas kama tafirru min al-asad." He said, flee from people as you would flee from a lion. And Sufyan al-Thawri, he continues on and mentioning them. But then he says, well, the people who say that it's good to be with people, they bring a lot of proofs. He said, most of those proofs are weak, except for one where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, المؤمن الذي يخالط الناس ويصبر على أذاهم خير من الذي لا يخالط ولا يصبر على أذاهم. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, the believer that interacts and mixes with the people and is patient upon their harm is better than the one who does not mix nor is not patient from their harm. And he says this is what most people use, and then he mentions a few others. The other points are a weaker proof, but this is sufficient of enough a proof. But then he continues on to saying, well, as we mentioned before, that people will differ in their positions in this based on their position in the world. Just like the people differing between being married and being alone. That it's going to be different based on their status and what they have going on and what's good for them and their disposition. And he says, I'm going to respond based on where I am. And I'm going to mention to you some benefits of being in spiritual isolation. And he said, I'll mention 6 of them. We're going to go over one of them or 2 of them, inshallah, and then we'll stop for today. He says the first thing that we need to, the first benefit that we need to know of being in spiritual isolation is that we will be alone to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll be alone to worship Allah. What's the point? وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, we have not created mankind and jinn except to worship Him. By being in uzla, by being in spiritual isolation, away from people, now we have the opportunity to focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worship Him as He wants to. But He continues on, and then we can taste and we can delight in calling upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The way in which you will not be able to do unless you're alone. When you're mixing with people, you're not raising your hands and making dua. You're not calling upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is difficult for us to then truly taste the sweetness of our ibadah when we're mixing with people. Those are 2 different types of ibadah. They both have purpose. They're both important, but they're very, very different. And so by being in isolation, now we can be free to actually spend time enjoying. Unfortunately, we think of being in isolation only physically away from people. When, Allah musta'an, we've got these things here and everyone's right in our pockets. So we start to make our dhikr, we start to make dua, and it's like, subhanallah, subhanallah, subhanallah. We're looking at our phones, we're checking to see what's on Instagram, and I'm guilty of this just as everyone else. But how much hudur, how much presence of heart do we have if we're actually distracted? Inshallah, we get rewarded for intention. Inshallah, we get the reward for the effort. But what is the quality of that ibadah that we do when we're truly alone, dealing with ourselves, trying to be focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? SubhanAllah. In mindfulness retreats, they talk about people that go for days to be away from everyone, focused on mindfulness meditation. Not Muslims, right? They said it takes them usually 2 to 3 days to overcome being attached to their phones. They take their phones, put them in bags, take them away from people. The first 2 to 3 days are full of anxiety. Where is my phone? What am I doing? I don't even know how to be with myself alone. After 2 or 3 days, they start to fall into a rhythm of being comfortable with this. So what about us where we don't even give ourselves time? SubhanAllah. We don't even give ourselves an opportunity to actually be alone with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's the quality of our salah and our dhikr? If we come to salah, we make wudu, and Allahu Akbar, there's no nothing. The Prophet ﷺ used to spend time, as soon as the adhan is called, he would go to the masjid. He would try to then prepare himself for salah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be free, both physically and emotionally, from people to actually taste the sweetness of iman and ibadah. Uwais al-Qarni, he says that, before that, he says some of the wise people were asked, which thing is more beneficial, to be in zuhud, to be someone who's in the dunya but ascetic from it, their heart's not attached to it, or to be in khalwa, to just be completely removed of everything? And they responded with the one that is better for your heart, the one which you're able to find a sweetness of your ibadah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in. That's the one that's better. So, and think about that. We're all going to be in different stages, in different stations of life. And that may mean that sometimes we'll be in one state of ibadah that will work for us, and then we'll have to shift to be alone or to be in a different state. So maybe you should not go to shahada as much if you're not married. But then after marriage, it's okay, you go with your spouse. One may be better for you to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and one may not be. I like throwing shade on the brothers here, because of course the sisters aren't going to shahada. Uwais al-Qarni, he says, I never saw anyone that knew the Lord except that they were also at the same time able to find sweetness in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once you've tasted the sweetness of iman, the sweetness of ibadah, of knowing who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, nothing will replace it in that same way. Nothing will be as meaningful in the same way. And for us, it may be lahadhat. It may be like glimpses. The flicker of an eye. You may just find yourself, you see a horizon one day, you see a sunset, you see a landscape, you're like, subhanallah. The clouds may be off in the distance. You think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you feel something both emotionally and spiritually, you're connected on a different level. It may be that one prayer, the one ayah that you know that like hits your heart. Or maybe it wasn't even the understanding, it was the qira'ah of the Imam. Maybe because the Quran is a miraculous book, maybe the way the Imam recited it that one time, it touched your heart and you felt something. Or maybe the opposite. The sweetness of Iman came when you're in the pits, in the depths of difficulty and hardship, but you're able to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you kept going. That's also sweetness that we oftentimes overlook. We think that Iman and the sweetness of it only is like when things are amazing. It's also when we're able to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when things suck. Shaykh Abdul-Qadir Jilani said, أعظم الكرامة الاستقامة, that the greatest miracle is to be able to be upright. So once we've been able to taste that, what will ever replace it? He says, know that whoever is able to have ease and being consistent in dhikr and in the sweetness or appreciating or a closeness, affection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they're able to be consistent in their contemplation in which they're able to find a state of gnosis, a state of closeness, like a psycho-spiritual connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is better for them than everything that comes with mixing with others. So what he's saying is, if you found that in dhikr, or being in spiritual isolation, then that's what's good for you. And you should lean into it. And that's better than all the social networking and the benefits that you're getting. Because again, we like to focus and we think of Islam being like ones and zeros. We think of Islam as I go to the lecture. And also it's not only ones and zeros, it's like chronological, like that's not the word I'm looking for. It's where we're on a journey that has a distinct end, that we always will be progressing. It's progressive, I think that's the word. In the sense that like, okay, khalas, if I want to be multazim, I want to be religious, I want to be conservative, I want to be practicing, I need to, first I'm going to put the clothes of righteousness on, but I'm not going to troll you guys there, but let's start praying, and then I'm going to go to halaqat, and then I'm going to be around those religious people, which is going to lead to me then praying more and making more dhikr, and I'm going to be righteous. Maybe I'll seek knowledge and I'll become a student of knowledge and I'll become a scholar. And it becomes this very linear, progressive track to righteousness in our minds. When the reality is so many people are righteous and we overlook them because they don't have knowledge or they're not known as a person of knowledge. And perhaps some of the most wicked people are the people in front of the microphone right here. Perhaps our hearts are some of the worst, full of arrogance, full of showing off, full of looking down upon others. May Allah forgive all of us. But what we have to do is make sure that we understand that connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be based on what is best for us. And it's not a linear progressive track. It's one that has peaks and valleys, that has ups and downs, that perhaps it will come by the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He give us tawfiq, and it happens overnight. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us an understanding or a recognition of ourselves or of the dunya, or we're like, khalas, I'm leaving all of this, and it happens very drastically. Perhaps it happens over a long period of time and a lot of hard work. Regardless, we have to reframe our focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and change it from being this progressive linear track to reach a certain station, and rather focus it on a perpetual unveiling of our own deficiencies in our hearts. Perpetually trying to purify our hearts, and not just purify our hearts to be more righteous, more humble, more God conscious, but at the same time recognizing who we are. You know, subhanAllah, one of my teachers have mentioned that in Hadith Jibreel, and we're asked about what is ihsan, what is spiritual excellence. Usually when we tell you that when the hadith is narrated, and ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarah, wa in lam takun tarahu fa innahu yarak, that you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see him. And if you can, and knowing that you can't see him, you know that he sees you. A different pronunciation of the same changes the whole meaning. And ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarah, wa in lam takun tarah. You worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see him. Wa in lam takun, stopping right there. And if you cease to exist, tarah, that's when you will see. And so when we can get over ourselves and think about ourselves less and focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when we'll truly be able to have insight, and that's when we'll truly be able to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make all of us from those people. The second benefit from being in isolation is that it allows us to stop sinning that happens most of the time when we're around people. And he said those are 4 different major types of sins. The first is ghiba. If we're in isolation, spiritual isolation, intentionally staying away from people, that means from social media as well, we're less likely to tell carry, we're less likely to backbite, we're less likely to slander, because we don't have an opportunity to do that. So not only is it protecting us spiritually, it's also protecting us worldly as well. People aren't mad at us because we were talking about them. People aren't mad that we've spread tales about them. We haven't hurt someone. We haven't embarrassed someone, which is a right that our brothers and sisters have on us. So the second one that he mentioned is that when we're in spiritual isolation, the commanding of good and forbidding the evil that we have to do in public is now just focused inward on ourselves. But perhaps when we're dealing with others, commanding good and forbid the evil, we'll see evil and we won't say anything, which is a sinful thing for us to do. We see evil and we become accustomed to it. We let it go. And that becomes something that harms us. Or perhaps the opposite occurs. By us now making inkar, by us stopping the evil or telling someone about the wrong that they've done, now we become harmed by that. The person looks at us in a certain way, we've hurt a friendship. But by being in spiritual isolation, I don't have to worry about either. I'm just khalas between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A third harm that comes by interacting with people, which is really, really important, for all of them are important, but this is really important, is riyah, showing off or ostentation. And this is a poison that is intoxicating. Because when we start to interact with people, we start to feel that we are a certain way. And perhaps it's not in the way that we usually look at it. By us interacting with people, we think that we're better, and then we think we're the best thing to ever walk the face of the earth. Perhaps by interacting with people, people harm us, and we start to look down at them. Not necessarily that we're better, but now we are highlighting, our minds hyper focus on the mistakes that they're making, the humble bragging they do, the showing off they do, the whatever they're trying to cover up. And so now we're hyper focusing on them. But us recognizing those things inherently, we're hyper focusing on ourselves at the same time, because I don't do that. And so now it's an insidious form of showing off that happens when we interact with people. But if we're not dealing with people, or then he mentions that sometimes even now how we interact with people will be prideful. Someone asks us how we're doing and we respond in a prideful way. And that we need to be careful and mindful that even in our sort of regular conversations, we need to be thoughtful about how we respond. Are we being intentional? Are we being thoughtful? Or that we responding in a way that is performative, that we're being exaggerative and extra in how it is, in a way to show off. How are you doing? Alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed me, akhi, mashallah, the dunya, I saw the sun. Well, shut up, bro. It's all good. Like, we don't have to be extra. Wallah, I should write like a whole blog post, or like I have a whole rant that inshallah one day you could record. Like, be normal should be like the first step of spirituality. Don't be extra, be normal. Because a lot of our performative religiosity starts off with us trying to be extra, trying to perform what we think religiosity is, inshallah with the best intentions. But now we become this exaggerative, almost cartoonish version of ourselves that isn't who we are. On one hand, we need to work on becoming better people. On another hand, we need to make sure that we're not being performative. I'll give you a small story. I think I may have shared it before. I share stories all the time, so I'm sorry if I already shared it. I was going to visit one of my teachers in London, 2018. And one of my mentors and big brothers, may Allah bless him, he knew that I'm not a very experienced world traveler. I lived alone, but I lived in one little city. I didn't do too much. And he felt bad for me, so he left where he was to come accompany me on this journey. But before, I was really excited, and I was like, I'm going to see all the students of the Sheikh, and we're going to meet my brothers. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I want to see the students, and we're going to be together as brothers. And he said, why are you talking about them like there's something special about them? He said, you shouldn't talk about any students of the Sheikh in any way that's different than you talk about any other Muslim. And you shouldn't expect anything from them that you wouldn't expect from any other Muslim. And you shouldn't give them any more than you'd give any other Muslim. He said, yes, you have a connection because you guys are both students of the same Sheikh and you have things in common, or you've heard different things. Khair wa barakah. But you should also not forget the haqq that each of us have as brothers. He told me another time, even the honorific titles that we give each other, Habib, Sidi, Akhil Kareem, all these different terms, he said, don't say it unless you really mean it. When you say Habib, do you really love that brother or sister? Or is it just something performative? Are you showing off by saying these things? So we need to be mindful of how it is that we're interacting, making sure that we're not being extra. May Allah protect us from extraness. The fourth and final thing that we'll stop on today, inshallah, is that by being around others, then we will take from their shameful or bad characteristics. By us now going out, we're going to, almost via osmosis, by being around people, we will passively, somewhat unconsciously, naturally take on some of the characteristics they have. Unless we are vigilant and striving not to do that. And so we just have to be very, very careful that when we're with people, how we are with them, but also know that being alone sometimes is good for us. I think for the context of us as young adults, something that'll be very, very important for you and for me, for all of us, inshallah, this microphone's gonna drive me crazy, is to recognize something that's important for us, is to recognize how much socialization each of us needs. Recognize, because if you don't have that, then perhaps you'll start to feel lonely, perhaps you'll start to feel depressed, perhaps you'll feel a certain way. And we've made you a balanced ummah. So it's not that we should always be in isolation, nor that we should always be with people. My suggestion is that we recognize how much interaction we need, and make sure that we're getting that. Outside of that, we should busy ourselves with things that are of other importance. In order to busy ourselves with other things outside that, we need to have goals and aspirations, things that you're working toward, things that you'd like to accomplish, things that you'd like to do, things that you're interested in, hobbies, interests. Sometimes we become so dependent on our friends that they become the hobby, they become the interest, and now that just being with people is the maqsad in of itself, is the goal in of itself. But if we can figure out what our goals and what our aspirations are, and then also with that simultaneously, what is the quotient, how much interaction we have, we can aspire to that, try to get it, and keep moving on. And then also recognize that at different times of our lives, the different seasons that we go through, it's going to naturally change. Summer vacation is going to be different than school year. Married life is going to be very, very different than being single. Married without children is going to be very, very different than married with children. Having 2 jobs is going to be different than having no job, etc. And be merciful and gentle with ourselves. And then, again, trying to make sure that when we are, khalas, we hit our quotient. Because at a certain point, it just becomes hanging out for the sake of hanging out. Masking whatever loneliness or other feelings that we have. We need to deal with those feelings and work on them by channeling them and elsewhere. For anything that I said was correct from Allah, Allah alone. Anything is incorrect from myself and shaitan, I want to open the floor for a Q&A, inshallah.